Okay, we are recording. I will not do my introduction again, which was not being recorded, but we're grateful for the generosity of your time, Ascan Mergenthaler, and very much welcome to New York Institute of Technology. We're very pleased and honored to have you here today.
Yeah, well, thank you, Tom, for the introduction, and also thank you for the invite. And of course, the pandemic has not many positive sides, but one of them, of course, is probably that we all got used to this format quite a bit, and it's easier for us to participate in remote locations in these kind of events. Before, it was always involved with heavy traveling, and now, of course, this is a lot easier. It's not the same quality, I guess, but it's good. It's good enough, and hopefully, and it's nice that I can participate in that kind of way in your school. I have to start off. I mean, while you were introducing myself and the topic today, I had to confess, or I have to confess that maybe there was a slight misunderstanding in terms of what the focus of the topic is. I did not focus too hard on the facade, but I mean, I guess in my presentation now, because I thought it was interesting to explain a little bit the incredible journey we made with this project. Not only the build result, which a lot of people can of course see now and experience, but it was a long and very interesting journey to get there where we are, and I thought I would focus on that a little bit. Also the facade at the very end, but I'm happy to answer any questions if it's more technical questions later on, and I'm sure I hope I can answer all of them. All right, so I try to share my screen now. How does this look? Does it work? Do you see Herzog De Meuron?
Yes.
Great. All right. So, I mean, not really necessary to introduce this project where it is and so on, but I mean, I was always fascinated by Hong Kong. Hong Kong is an amazing place, not only because it's an island, but of course also, I think you can see this in this aerial here quite clearly, the density of urban structures packed together so closely, plus the nearness of the ocean, plus the plants and the nature, which is so incredibly dense and close to everything. There's not many places in the world where you do have this. And so, I guess architects, at least myself, was always fascinated by this long before this project. And of course, also by, projects like the Walled City, for example, or special moments, let's say, in urban history, like the Walled City. This was always a huge attractor, and I always wanted to do something there. So when the opportunity arose, while we were working on other projects in China, we were extremely glad that in Hong Kong, we had the opportunity to meet the Hong Kong Chocolate Club, who was basically on a mission to teach the Hong Kong people about how to deal with heritage and how to deal with the history of their own place in a way. Because what basically happened is that because of the incredible economic situation of Hong Kong, everything old has to go, and there's not a lot of respect in terms of for old things. And I think they wanted to create a showcase how to deal with these historic structures, and how can these historic structures, rather than just being nicely renovated, how can they also be revitalized? Also, how can you re-inject life into them so that they're not just a dusty, boring museum place, but that they're really full of energy and fully integrated in the energy and in the flows of the city. And that was the mission. And now, I would say, how many years later? This is probably, almost 14 years later. We can say that this was a successful mission, and it really is working very well. again, also difficulties because of the pandemic, but still it's a very active place. It's a very appreciated place, and people really go there for all kinds of things, not only just to see the site, but also to find a place where they can be in calm, where they can engage with culture, where they can have a coffee or a meal, or where they can meet friends. It's basically doing everything. It's a true mixed use site. So centrally located, obviously between Lang Kwai Fong and Soho and Central and Hong Kong Park. Hong Kong used to be, of course, and that's the time where these buildings come from, used to be a very low dwelling, so to say. And it's the opposite by now. We all know this. And the very special thing about this site was that it's so centrally located, and it's really like so surrounded by this wall of high-rise buildings, so to say. And it's literally a courtyard within the city, almost an oasis of some sort. And that was a very special moment, and we always felt from the very beginning it's important to keep this aspect of the site. So we did a very thorough, as a first step, we proposed to Hong Kong Jockey Club to do a very thorough analysis of the site. And we came up with it was a book, you know, almost 100 pages thick, where we looked closely what is there and how can we work with what is there. And the conclusion of that exercise was basically a couple of main theses, which we summarized in this document. And the funny thing is, although this summary is already, as I said before, like 13 years old, it is until the very last day of the project very valid and important. So first one is the relationship to the urban context. I mean, to connect basically all these different districts around the site, and to make, although it was a prison yard and completely closed off the city, how can you make that place accessible and really engage with the city fabric just around without destroying the character of being also somewhat isolated in a special place within the city. Number two, and that has very much to do with what I said just before, is the wall as a monument. The most important aspect of this whole development is the Redmond Wall, the wall around the prison wall, the wall around the compound. And that's how basically most Hong Konger until the revitalization have experienced the site. And still now, it's still very much, you know, inspiring and informing the experience of the site. So it was clear to us that this wall has to stay, and that we also have to keep the punctures we kind of do into this wall as minimal and small as possible. Number three, it's a cluster of historic buildings. It's not just one historic building. It's really it's a cluster of very different historic buildings. Some of them have been headquarters for the police, so had a little bit more of a showy kind of side to it, and others were prison buildings with cells. So a very diverse collection of also of historic buildings. And it was important to us that you would experience them as an original condition as possible, so that we would really refrain from altering them. And there were only two moments here. You can see this in this dashed lines, the two dashed lines in the top corner, left and right. Those are the only later additions which were not worth keeping, and basically showed us a certain potential of building something new, but everything else was important enough to be kept. The fourth point is that we have this very interesting, within this oasis or this courtyard in the city, we have again another selection of courtyards. One being very enclosed because it used to be the prison yard, the other one a bit more open because it used to be the parade ground, but also smaller moments of almost like squares and plazas. And that's something we always liked. It's almost something you know from a European city, and it's a little bit foreign to the concept of an Asian city, or especially Hong Kong, which is mainly dominated by commercial buildings, some commercial parks, and you know, this typical, like say, urban square, like an empty place within surrounded by building is rather rare, and it's nice to have that in a condensed version here on this site. And we always felt it's important to keep these and to strengthen their character and identity throughout the project. And then, of course, the idea of basically connecting all these different aspects of the site by heritage trails, like very intimate trails, almost like when we saw the site for the first time, it was a huge discovery. You know, it was really like going through barbed wire and stuff, and it was really like narrow alleys, wider alleys. It was really, it's a maze also in a certain way, and to keep this kind of labyrinthic quality alive and really invite the people to discover the site on their own was something we felt is also important and an integral part of the heritage. And lastly, and that's very important to this whole idea of revitalization, it was clear that we want to introduce more cultural program, you know, and that really a lot of activity, the more diverse activity, the better it is to the diversity of the site and the buildings on site. It was important that we would also have, you know, all kind of different cultural activities happening on site. And where would they go and where do we place them? They for sure would not fit all of them in historic buildings. So there was also the need to create something new. So in graphic terms, it's a cluster of historic buildings. They all have their own identity and character, and we would kind of keep them and restore them in a kind of most original kind of way, slight adaptations so that the new program functions can go into them, but refrain from major alterations, also for mechanical reasons and so on. So we would put all of these things, the major things we need to improve the site, we would put that and consolidate that in the two empty areas we identified here in the back. The two big existing green spaces, green open public spaces, and to preserve them. And then the readaptive reuse of the existing buildings. So a lot of these things can fit into the existing buildings without ripping out too much of the partitions and so on, small scale stuff. And this intimate scale is also interesting and nice and adds to the character of the place. But there are, of course, larger things like, you know, gallery spaces, auditoriums. At that time, it was also the idea of a theater and so on. Where would they go? How can we integrate them in the site without destroying these historic buildings? And we came up with this crazy idea, which is basically a one-to-one translation of the zoning envelope. Hong Kong has a very specific zoning law, which is basically a certain angle from the windowsill of the adjacent buildings up to the sky. I think it's a quite steep angle of 82.5 degrees. And that resulted basically in this invisible potential envelope, jelly mold almost, within you could place these additional programs. And we, of course, coming from Switzerland, we were immediately attracted to this and thought, wow, we want to be part of the Hong Kong skyline. That would be great. It's like our building is like a protecting hand above the historic buildings. And we push all these new functions into this almost like a social, cultural, public sculpture in the back. You know, something you can very different than the typical commercial tower in Hong Kong, which is typically not accessible for the public besides around the base, but the rest of the building typically not. And even the top of the buildings is rarely accessible. So why would we not make this building something which is accessible for all Hong Kongers? And that made it, and also there we had this enough room for the larger scale cultural programs, and they would basically be stacked up in this almost like a shelving-like building. And we would even continue with this network of paths, which I have identified throughout the site in this vertical dimension also. And we would also continue with this idea of the green or the open space and bring that also in the vertical dimension. And that resulted then in this overall concept, which we called, it's like a vertical landscape almost, yeah, or like a vertical master plan with a lot of the same porosity, the same openness, the same network of paths, of connections, of circulation, which you typically have in a horizontal surface. We would also create that in a vertical surface. And that was the final scheme then of the design, And we had a lot of support for this scheme, but also a lot of questions. And the client then asked us to create an exhibition, and we made a huge exhibition with them, a public consultation process, so to say, where we showed the entire process, how we got there, and explained the rationale, a little bit similar to what I just did now, but in a much more elaborate format. And the funny thing was that the Hong Kong public reacted at the end of the day very negatively on this scheme. Not another tall building. We like the small scale of the development. Why do we need this huge development at the end of the historic site? And although we had all these beautiful models showing the also for us very interesting journey to get there, and also this idea of, for example, bringing space, structure, and facade all in one organism, this full integration, which is always something we're very much interested in. We were simply not able to convince them about the quality of this scheme. So we had to go back to the drawing board, and that's happens to us in quite a few projects. Tom, you mentioned before the Parish Art Museum is another example where we radically had to redesign the project, but we never closed the doors when a client approaches us with this ask, and we could also be stubborn, I guess, or say, well, you either take this or leave it, but we actually are quite open-minded and curious to hear out what are the next steps and how can we improve our design to make it work better with the context and what the people of Hong Kong really think fits well in their city. So the second try we did is we understood they don't like tall buildings, but nevertheless, there was some fascination about this verticality around the site. And we felt, well, maybe we just take one of these vertical towers and put it flat as a bar over the site. Again, this idea of connecting these two voids, so to say, with something very horizontal, very flat, but yet you're still above the historic site. You understand the historic site when you're in this bar. And could we do something out of that? Also here, the idea of making the facade of the building and the structure of the building and the spaces of the building like one object, fully integrated, and that's something we liked also, I guess, about the historic buildings, because they're also a little bit like this, where the deep verandas also have a functional point of view in terms of protecting the buildings from too much solar gain, etc., etc. So you can see also here quite a bit of respect towards the old structures, never touching them, always floating above them, but occupying these two holes. One was dedicated for theater, the cross-spanning bar was galleries, and the other one was this covered outdoor space. And a lot of these aspects are still there now in the finally built design. But even this one here was for the public, again, too monumental as a gesture. And they came back to us again with a very restrictive zoning envelope, so to say, which was then implied onto the site from the Architects and Monument Board of Hong Kong. And with that, it was clear that we can only build volumes in these two empty sites of more or less or similar proportion of the historic buildings. So another downsize, but we took it relatively sporty and continued again, but with the same logic and the same approach of the earlier concept. So what do we have? We have the courtyards in the compound. We have the links towards the Ho, towards Lang Kwai Fong, which should go directly through the site, also down to the mid-level escalators in Pottinger Street, and ideally also some kind of internal link between the two big outdoor spaces, the two courtyards, the parade ground and the prison yard. So all of these ingredients are still there. And we also, at the same time, felt it's very important to strengthen the character of these two courtyards in a more direct and more active way. So the parade ground was always a little bit more the open one, the active one. So we would propose that, you know, most of the retail and food and beverage outlets and so on would go there, and also make it more accessible from all sides. It's really like a welcoming courtyard, a first encounter with the site. And then the upper one, which is the prison, or used to be the prison yard, is much more closed and isolated, and that we would keep this aspect also. And that you would feel this also, you would express it architecturally. And from the program, we also felt it's important that it's roughly a third, and a third. So a third arts and culture, a third food and beverage, and a third public use and other spaces, you know, and that worked out quite well until now. And it's a good mix, and it makes really the entire site work. So this is a photo of the build project, and you can see now these two volumes which fill exactly these gaps in the historic fabric. All historic buildings are kept in their original condition and state, of course renovated, but very carefully renovated. And then the two empty sites are occupied by these floating volumes. And by floating, I mean not only in section, but also in plan. So they never touch the neighboring buildings. There's always a gap between the historic buildings and the new buildings, and that gap is especially big basically at the bottom of them. So they also elevated in section, opening up a connection through the site for the public. And this plan is it's a section, and a plan is quite nice because it shows how all these different spaces are also, it's like a master plan. It's like a city within the city with so many different scales of spaces, from very large to very small, being a jail cell. You have everything there. You have small alleys, you have larger alleys, you have squares, you have little shortcuts. It's a very interesting compound, and we kind of just continued this by adding or stitching, continuing the weave, almost you could say, of this historic and urban fabric of the site. But maybe the real invention, or the most important invention, is really this lifting the buildings in the upper prison yard. On one hand, by that you still define, with the two facades, you still define the close character of the space, but then just beneath the buildings you open up and you have the public flow into the site, but also not only flow into the site, but also to activate these spaces. They're used, you can use them. They're protective outdoor spaces from rain and sun. So you can see here quite nicely how these historic buildings are, you know, together with the new buildings, are forming really this very precise outline of the prison yard. But then, you know, you can also see how the floating aspect opens up a new space, a new public space, which can be used in a very informal, very direct, very impromptu way for lectures, cinemas, or just outdoor cinema, or just hanging out there. All is possible, and that's something we really like. That's a real added value which was not there before. And you see also the historic buildings right next to it. You see now here this gap, but these historic buildings, we kept them in their original condition. This is the same building we just saw from the outside, E-Hall. But although we kept the jail cells and all that, they become supportive facilities for the new buildings. So in that case, a large auditorium and the green room and a bar and the ticketing and all this thing is happening in here. But they become really like, they serve each other, these two buildings, so to say. Whereas the mechanical power comes from the new build. So there we have a lot of all the cooling equipment and all the new air conditioning units for the entire site will sit in this new building. You can see here, also on the very top, all of this is like a Kraftwerk, like the powerhouse basically for the entire site. And then you have only small pipes into the historic buildings rather than destroying the historic buildings with their own individual air conditioning units. So that was a little bit the strategy. So they're really serving each other, supporting each other, and they form this kind of strategic partnership, so to say, old and new. Floating, this was, for example, I mean, by discovering this hole in the historic fabric, we also discovered this huge empty hole that there used to be the laundry yard for the prison. And rather than filling this up with program, we felt it would be actually really beautiful if we could use the height of the space, not only to bring up the people onto the elevated prison yard level, but really to create a unique space for the people to sit and enjoy things that happen there for free most of the time. And this is a great image, but many of a movie night they're having there. They have regular movie nights, but they also have lectures there. They have all kind of things, and it's quite beautiful because Hong Kong is also one of these cities where often public spaces are just occupied by the people. And like this, we continue with this idea, you know, that people couldn't just sit on these steps. It's very informal. It's very low threshold. It's very inviting. And you know, you have this you're in an outdoor space, but at the same time the external facades of the historic buildings form almost like an indoor environment, you know, so something which is an external facade suddenly becomes an internal facade. So that's quite nice and quite special, almost like a theater, an interior of a theater. And then there's this huge structural component to facilitate the floating aspect of the project. But not only that, this structural column is expressed as a column, but it's also housing the important cores, of course, and egress stairs. But it's also a moment of establishing various levels of scale and relationship with the adjacent walls, adjacent buildings, and so on. It's really forming a very intimate moment, all the way down to this bench at the very base of it, so where people can sit on it. So again, the scale of a person, and how do you relate to these, you know, what you could think is almost like a monumental space. Suddenly these moves break it down and bring it all the way down to the scale of a human being. On the inside, this is the same staircase. On the inside, this also becomes a very special moment. It's not just a necessity. The egress stair is a spatial experience, and then also the windows are placed in such a way that you always get framed views of and moments of reorientation where you are in the site. So that's also kind of key and important. So traveling from A to B is an experience and not just a necessity. And that's the Moratorium Hall. Above, again, also a very multifunctional space, which has been used already for lectures, dance performances, artist performances, talks, screenings, concerts, everything. So it's also nice. And again, with this window, if you want it, but you can also close it back to the prison yard. So also there, this relationship back to where you are. The other volume is dedicated to galleries. It's the Old Bailey wing. It's two large galleries stacked on top of each other, and then in between sandwiched a public level of cafe, library, bookshop, something like that. So different expression on the interior, but also something like the other one where you experience the vertical circulation. I mean, basically already the site has all these nice alleys and stairs, and we kind of bring and continue this kind of language of stairs into these buildings and make special moments out of it. The one for the auditorium is more of an angular character, and the one for the gallery is more of a spiral, more organic shape and character. This is an image of one of these alleys, like we found them before we started work on the site. And you can see already the quality somehow. And we're kind of proud that all of this is kept in a very original kind of way. So you will have always these moments when you walk through the site of discovery and of the old buildings, of the new buildings. It's almost like interwoven in a way also. These are passages from basically new passages, creating important links between the old buildings, which were not possible before, and really is animating a very interesting exterior space. This was the big divide between police and prison. So suddenly you have these bridges between these two very different, originally, historically very different functions and areas of the site. And when you travel through the site, you always have these moments of discovery where you then see these new structures floating above you. And speaking about floating above you, and then this also picks up a little bit of this idea of the facade. I thought this is an interesting image because it explains quite nicely how the old and the new comes together. On one hand, I think you see that the scale of the very important and significant granite wall is picked up with a new structure with these aluminium blocks. But on the other hand, you also see that it's something new. It's a solid facade, but it's an open and a porous facade, and it's a much lighter facade than the stone facade. And I think that's very important, that on one hand, the new build structures are part of the overall fabric and character of the site, but on the other hand, they also clearly are distinctive and separate of it, and are clearly modern and contemporary interventions. So that was important that we kind of get this right, that on one hand, they engage with the context, but on the other hand, they also clearly stand out. And finally, just a few words on the facade. So when we developed these elevated volumes, it was kind of clear to us that the facade of these volumes should ideally respect or engage or work a little bit with these very characteristic big, large granite walls around the site. And but rather than using, granite blocks, which would have been far too heavy, of course, to lift them up in the air, we would use a very different material, a much lighter material. And the idea there was that we would basically, since we're so close to Shenzhen and these places where die casting and recycling, aluminium industry, and all that is so close, we felt it may be interesting to work with that industry, an industry which is not very well known to the construction industry, but use them to produce these new contemporary granite blocks in a way. And that these blocks in scale and format, you can see that here, really relate to the granite wall with the 90 centimeters by 30 centimeters. But that they, rather than forming a solid wall, they would really form a sunscreen, which is absolutely needed for all the different functions we have. And the three functions we have is first the closed gallery wall condition, where the climate in Hong Kong is so aggressive that even there it's important that we kind of screen the direct sun away from the closed wall so it gets less hot. That's an advantage. And also we have enough of a gap in between that the hot airs also can escape again. So it's really like, it's a brise-soleil, so to say, in front of a solid wall. But of course, the brise-soleil is absolutely also needed in front of windows. That's also clear, but there at the same time, you also want to look out a little bit. And then lastly, we have a lot of mechanical pieces in these new buildings because they are the powerhouse for the entire site. So we need a lot of perforation also to allow for the airflow in and out. And we want to hide these ugly technical machines, of course. So that's why we came up with this one form. It's always the same mold, which is basically the bottom one. You see that here, with this kind of nose, with a very tight opening, just enough for the air to come in and out. And then basically we cut this nose away in 4 different steps. And by that, we increase the opening of this block. And wherever we needed then larger openings, we put the ones with the larger opening, and where we were fine with the smaller one, we put the ones with the smaller one. And that created this really nice effect, so that you could also, in front of windows, this opening is almost as big as a real window. So it's not really an obstacle, but it's really like a frame view to the outside. Whereas in other more technical zones, it kind of it shields what is behind. And that's very much true, especially when you look up from below up and not onto it straight. And that's typically the case, of course, that you would look up in this scenario. So these are mock-ups we did there locally, where we also tested different finishes from, is it aluminum, raw aluminum, or is there some anodizing process? Is it darker? Is it lighter in color? How does it age? And so on. All these things were discussed. And also, what is interesting is this corner condition, and these are very special moments always. How do you then bring these things together? So also when you look in a brick wall or the granite wall, the moment where they form a corner, were typically always expressed in a kind of specific way. They always become a little bit more special moments. And we felt by cutting these aluminium stones, so to say, if you want, in these different angles. Also, in one row we give the left one the priority, in the next row we give the right one the priority. You create this kind of very nice stitching effect, how this comes together. And it's not very precise. It's actually also a little bit unprecise, but it creates it makes the corner stronger and a clearer statement. So we were quite happy with these results. So that was not clear from the beginning, something we tested, and then we felt it's adequate. It's important to know, and that was, going back to this idea of building industry and non-building industry. So when we then decided on the aluminum, there is something really beautiful about this whole process. And as you know, hopefully we used everything, the entire aluminum is 100% recycled. It's car wheels. It used to be car wheels, and they recycle them. And then from that recycled material, they form these ingots. And then with these ingots, through a very interesting die casting process, this is the factory here, images of the factory, we were able to press these bricks, these new granite blocks in a way. They're all the same, with this one difference, that we basically then later in the next step decided where to cut them. And we also, in terms of how they are placed in the overall facade arrangement, we did a drawing of every single block. So we knew exactly with the computer where each block would go. So they all had numbers and little codes. So it was really like Lego, so to say, when they came on site, and it was already clear where each one of these things would go. Otherwise, it would have been not possible. And then there's the last aspect was about the surface treatment. Hong Kong has an extremely aggressive climate with the salt water, with the typhoon, with the winds, and so on, and the harsh sun. So we had to work quite a bit on the surface treatment of these, and it was also important that that it was not completely smooth, but that it basically had a surface texture similar to actually what the granite stones also had, and that's also something we liked. And then as a next step, We also, here that's again this corner situation. We brought this also down to all the concrete we had below. I mean, the stairs, the support, the cores, and so on. We didn't want to introduce another cladding material that would have felt wrong somehow. So we've thought positive about exposing the bones, really the structure of the buildings, what is holding up the stuff. But at the same time, we felt uncomfortable with just exposing the raw concrete. And that's why we proposed then to needle granite. As first of all, we used the formwork in a proportion which again mimics a little bit the proportion of the granite wall, but then on top is not only deformed, but also then the surface treated with this needle gun machine, which again gives us a texture which is very similar to the granite block. And suddenly something which looks typically quite raw, industrial infrastructure-like almost, becomes very tactile, soft, warm, and beautiful, just by this additional and last coat of surface treatment, so to say. Yeah. Yeah, and these are the last two images where you can see how these two new buildings become really part of the fabric of Hong Kong. You know, they stand out, but they're not too loud. They kind of also blend in a certain sense. They feel also right in their proportion and volume and massing. Yeah, and I think the day and night, and I think people of Hong Kong are very happy with this result, and they played their important role to get there. I mean, it was actually one of these projects where the public consultation process proved to be the right one and triggered ultimately the better result at the end of the day. All right, that was my little intro to the project.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Ascan. That's really so informative and really gripping. So much that's either not evident in either experiencing the project directly and live or through photographs, publications, drawings, and such. So grateful that you could share all that with us. I will pass on to our students who will lead the questions and sort of informal interview, who are Tammy No, Sohei No, and Yuti Kotari. Over to yourselves.
Hi, this is Tammy No. First of all, I wanted to say we are so honored to have you here. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. Really appreciate it. I have several questions in addition to your side introduction earlier. Like I have a question regarding with the context you mentioned. Aside from the limited site of the Tai Kwun Cultural Centre, especially as it is nested within one of the densest city in the world, have you faced any other challenges other than you mentioned earlier related to the transformation of the historical context from the formerly closed off part of the city to become open public space? If you have other than you.
Also, like you mean from a heritage point of view, also like from planning authorities and so on, or you mean like?
Yeah, like when you're changing the use of the like a program, or when you do the.
I mean, that was less of a problem, but I mean, so for example, we had a very strong ally with the client for this, also for this topic. And, you know, for very good projects, you always need a very good relationship with your client. And we definitely had that. And we started off on our own with the Hong Kong Chocolate Club, charities portion of Hong Kong Chocolate Club, and us. And the longer we worked on it, it became clear that we need the input of a heritage architect also, you know, and that person would be more respected in these multiple, and we had many of these discussions, presentations, exchanges with authorities, other stakeholders, you know, important community groups and so on. And that's why then in the next step, together with the client, we decided to bring Purcell on board. It's a heritage architect from London. It's also their first project or commission in Hong Kong. They now have an office there and continue to work there. So it was also an interesting exercise for them. And London kind of makes sense because they are colonial buildings, and basically the architects of these old buildings were basically English architects and engineers, and it was the role model was all England, you know. So it was interesting to get their point of view, and actually for us also a great help in justifying some of the moves we did. For example, you know, even the less important structures we had to demolish, the two I pointed out. That was not so easy just to say that, you know, it's not good, we can demolish it. I mean, they really prepared a storyline, a very thorough storyline, where they pointed out why it is okay to remove these buildings, whereas we have to keep the other ones. And I have to say, without them, it would have been very difficult, I think. So they were very good in this, and in creating a context and a storyline to explain why it makes sense to demolish this or to alter that, and whereas it's better to keep this and that.
Thank you. About the industrial context, further to your presentation, with regards to the recycled aluminum materials you showed before, making of the facade of the two new buildings, in which ways did the specific industrial context of the Hong Kong and especially the Shenzhen impact decision made during the design and production stages and the final outcome of the project?
Yeah. So as I said, you know, we felt the most sustainable approach also to this facade is to work with the industry, which is local, you know. And if you don't want to go, I mean, at the same time, we were working on quite a few projects in China where we experiment a lot with bricks and ceramics and so on, because that's also a local tradition, so to say, and can be done locally. We felt that this is not the right material for a number of reasons I outlined earlier on for the facade cladding of these two new buildings. So we were looking what other industry is there that could help us to create a really innovative and lighter and more functional and stronger facade for this project. And that's when we then had this idea of looking into the aluminum industry, which is very present in Shenzhen. And we also started all the early mock-ups. I mean, we approached these different companies, and when we developed these things with them, and it's really interesting because we got with all of these different companies, and we tried a few of them, only to a certain level, let's say to 90% of what we needed to make this facade really work. And the last 10% was missing. And it was just not precise enough. It was not durable enough. It had too many mistakes and so on. And it's interesting because, I mean, you would think that this industry, you know, works in a different kind of quality standard. But for the building, what we planned, it was not good enough. So at the end of the day, we ended up producing these things in Australia. So it was same storyline, but it is in Australia. And the only reason we could justify this in terms of sustainability is that the shipping, of course, you know, transporting these aluminum bricks, so to say, on a ship from Australia to Hong Kong is relatively straightforward and not too difficult, let's say, in terms of carbon footprint. It's not ideal, but it's also not the end of the world. But it was only in Australia that we then really basically got the bricks to that level of precision and quality that we needed for that building. So that was a little bit of a disappointment. And actually, by the way, we are building on a second project right now, or it's almost finished in Hong Kong, as you know, the M+. We had the exact same experience there with the ceramics, you know, and there we went with ceramics for the facade. we started off with local fabrication and manufacturers. And at the end of the day, they could just not bring and deliver the quality which is needed for a complex building like that. And also there we ended up producing the ceramic cladding, which has a very Chinese look and feel and really comes from the Chinese culture, is produced in Italy. So it's a funny world. So that's our experience with China so far.
Thank you for sharing that story.
Yeah.
I have one more question from my side. As Professor Verebes introduced our class earlier to you, in our seminar, we are looking at 6 outstanding built projects analyzed in relation to a set of 6 themes. And then this week's theme is modularity and mass customization with the Tai Kwun Cultural Centre, which is an expressive statement on the modularity, versatility, and then customizability, and some of the granular and porous effects. So in which ways do you believe the project to innovate on the use of design and production tools applied to the creation on differentiated custom effects, like 4 different types of the modules such as, and to what extent does the project perpetuate and rely on the mass production methods?
Maybe I'm in all of these questions a little bit too honest, but I don't think Tai Kwun is a good example for this, to be honest with you. It's a highly customized project, and at the end of the day, still, of course, this modularity and so on is there, and if we would not have that of the 4 bricks, then we would be in even bigger trouble. But at the end of the day, if you look at it, it is, for the scale of the buildings, they're not very big buildings and so on. It's quite a lot of effort for something. Yeah, I mean, it's certainly not mass production, and it's custom tailored for the site, for the specificity of the project and so on. And one could do something with it then on a larger scale. I think that's possible, a version of it and so on. But it would need much more repetition, simpler forms, simpler volumes, and so on. There were too many exceptions in these small buildings, so to say, to make this really like a role model that can be copied 100 times. I wouldn't recommend that. I think it's a one-off, to be honest with you.
Thank you. Over to Sohee.
Hi, I'm Sohee No, and first of all, I appreciate for the amazing presentation of this project. And you already explained and showed us about the another scheme and then mock-up model for the project, and it is really impressive and interesting. But we have the question regarding the facade modules and unit arrangement. Can you describe the design process followed and the ways you worked in the office and with your fabricator? How design information was controlled, and then how decisions were made, and how did you arrive to the 4 types of modules?
Yeah. So for that, a lot of computer technology was used, mainly Revit. I guess you're familiar with this, where we basically placed each brick in where it should be, because I mean, you have to imagine the buildings as a naked volume, and there were dedicated zones where it was clear that, for example, in that area we need 80% open, in that area we need 40% open, and in that area it's enough for 20. There we have a window, there we have a little air outlet, there we have a little air intake, and so on. And this information is something which is behind the facade, so to say. And then we arranged the bricks accordingly. So there was also a little bit of scripting involved, but at the end of the day, it was basically Revit. Every single brick was drawn, so to say, in a 3D model. And these 3D files also went then to the fabricator. We started off with Rhino because that's always a little bit faster and quicker for the initial prototypes and sketches. But then when you want to be really precise, Revit is the choice of software, because there you can really, I mean, it was basically down to each screw. It was really literally every screw was drawn as well. Quite complex. I mean, there was one person in our office basically for quite a few months only working on these facades of the two new projects.
Thank you. And another question.
What you asked it? Yeah, no, that was your question, no?
Yeah, right. Yeah. Oh, you already answered about my next question, but can you share with us how you prototype the composition of the aluminum brick and the various openings of each component? And then how did you determine and manipulate the certain level of the automation while having its versatility?
Also we started off with a very simple styrofoam form. We built ourselves in our office. We immediately jumped into scale 1:1. That was also something we wanted to understand. So we did not lose any time building small scale models of this facade. We immediately understood, okay, we want these bricks to be that size. That came from the granite wall, 90 by 30. So we basically almost literally cut styrofoam blocks of that size. And then we made these openings into them. We literally carved them out. And we built then a couple of these walls in our studio where we studied then what do you see through these bricks, so to say. How big do we want the opening? How, what about the radius? Is it more pill shape? Is it more squarish? All these things we already developed in-house before we even went to a manufacturer. And one interesting thing is when you look at the bricks, they have this smoother side, which is, maybe I should share the image again, then I can explain it better. So they have this side here on the left side, and that was always what we thought would be the side you would see. I mean, actually, you can probably also see this a little bit. It looks more like a granite block or a block of granite. And then you have this excavation in the middle. And when we had these models in our office, that they were hollow on the other side, because it was too much mass. Then we turned them around and then we looked at them from the other side, and then we thought, oh wow, that's actually much more interesting. And that's now on the right side. We have more depth, we have more play with the light, we create more shadow. The actual brick will be much more animated by the changing daylight conditions. And that's always something we were also very interested in, that, the buildings and the skins of the buildings and the perception of the building changes during the day and with the light and so on. And the building, does not always look the same. And then we decided to turn them around. And actually interesting, because the few moments where you look at this brick from the inside, you're very close to it. And it's actually quite nice that you then have a very smooth surface in front of your eyes and not this kind of, back facade, so to say. Whereas to the outside, it's actually quite nice to have this, you always have a distance to it. It's quite nice to look at this back facade because it has more play with light and shadow. So these are these processes, and it's always important to do this thing first in-house. And then once we were sure about the size and the scale of these things, we went then to these aluminum guys with these styrofoam blocks, not only with the drawing, but literally with the styrofoam block, and showed them, this is what we want. Can you do this for us? That's always something very important. If you want to engage with manufacturers, our experience is you have to first show them what you want in a one-to-one model, so to say. If you go to them with just a drawing, they often say, oh, no, too complicated, nah, not sure, and so on. But if you suddenly stand there and you say, okay, this is what I want, you know, can you do this? Then they're much more like, yeah, okay, yeah, it's, you know, it's easier for them to grasp. So, yeah, I mean, that's what I, does that, and then it was a back and forth. I mean, then once you engage with them, then it's always going back and forth. And then it's about, at the end of the day, it's about a few millimeters and precision and surface treatments and thicknesses and structural strength. And then, of course, the engineer is also involved, because also in our case, this facade is self-supporting. No, it forms like there's no additional structure holding it up. It is bolted on the building structure, but it's not a support structure for the brick itself. So it really has also a structural stiffness to it.
Thank you. Yuti will ask our next question.
Hello, I'm Yuki. First of all, thank you for making time for us and talking to us today. It was a amazing presentation. In addition to what you already spoke, you answered a few questions that I wanted to ask you. I wanted to ask about the effects of porosity, patterning, and expression of the facade, and how it worked according to the daylight, artificial lighting, and views on the inside. And like you already spoke about the framing and how you prototyped it. I wanted to ask you about the whole prototyping process and how it assisted you in the making the whole design decision.
Also the prototyping, I think I already responded to. Yeah, but for the first part of your question, the porosity, I also explained that already. It was very important, not only for we don't have many windows. We do have a few windows, but we have the big one in the auditorium and then a few other ones in the galleries, of course. But that's not driving it somehow. We could have cut also a hole for the window in the overall skin, I guess. It was really more the technical requirements driving the porosity of this. I mean, mainly the massive mechanical plant areas, which need have specific requirement. They always need a lot of open area. And that was also, like, for example, one reason why we created these relatively deep bricks, because by making them deep, it was clear that from most of the angles, you would not be able to see through them. I mean, you know, because if you think, for example, of a thin metal screen, which is 60 or 80% open, it's basically, you just look through, you're going to see everything. But because of the depth of the actual brick, the screening effect works much better. You know, I mean, it suited us also with this idea of connotating the granite block, but it's also, I mean, it really makes a lot of sense in that regard. And then the other reason, main reason, was really this idea of the brise-soleil, not only for the windows, but for the entire building. I mean, these aluminum blocks, they almost work as a heat sink. They become very hot during the day, and then during the night, they are like cooling ribs in a way, and they cool down. Yeah. So first of all, they avoid that the solid facade of the main building gets too hot to begin with, because you have a screen in front of it. But then also a lot of the solar energy is collected in them, and then during the night it's released with a slightly cooler air, and then they start fresh again. So it's an actually quite interesting way of creating a good thermal envelope dealing with the extreme heat conditions of Hong Kong. In terms of light, artificial light, that's an interesting point that you bring this. There was a lot of concern that also has to do with the public consultation in the exchange with the public, a lot of concern of the neighborhood groups that you would have light spillage, you know, or that you would basically, that these buildings would pollute with light the surroundings. And of course, also there, these louvers helped us a lot. You still get the glow from the inside, which is something we really wanted. We felt it's important that at night you feel the program and the activities behind, so you get these glowing surfaces, but at the same time, you never create any kind of light pollution or glare issues, which is also critical in this kind of dense urban context.
Thank you. I have one more question about the corner detail. I was reading your AD article on Tai Kwun Cultural Centre, and it caught my eyes. You said the corner detail is not perfect, it's imperfect, yet it's a strong one. And during your presentation right now, you said the same things, like what were the challenges did you face during developing of the corner and during the corner and the facade phase, and like can you describe what is the distinction between a strong and a weak corner?
Yeah. Again, I share my screen because I think that explains it the best. The most logical way, or let's say the cleanest way of making this corner is a mitre joint, no? Because you can easily imagine, that's a very simple geometry trick. If you cut this brick in 2 times 45 degrees, then of course it perfectly goes around the corner. Yeah? But that was almost too easy. And the funny thing is, by doing so, the building envelope almost fell apart, because it's not only that you just cut the brick in this 45-degree angle, you almost cut the entire building in that 45 degrees angle. And you know, that's something we tested actually, not in this with these aluminum blocks, that would have been too much work, but we did that in renderings and in 3D models. And it just didn't feel right, because you have these 2 corners, they fall apart, they don't hold together. And by basically now cutting them straight and then alternating, you bring them together like this. It's really like an interlock, you know, it's really like an interlocked corner. And that's very much how also brick walls, granite walls, corners are done. You know, you never cut bricks on a mitre. You always take the full brick and you go around the corner and then the next one on top of each other. It's important, the structural bond somehow. This bonding makes a lot of sense. And I think we did the same here. And because the shape of these bricks is so complex, when you do this, it's not just a rectangular box. It gets a little bit messy. It's not 100% perfect. You know, and that creates this nice, makes the corner even more interesting. You know, we don't always have 45, we don't always have 90 degrees angles, so that creates a little imperfection. The block itself, when you cut it, you know, has a little bit of funky moments. You can see this already here, but we like that, you know, and it makes it special. Here, this detail, for example, you know, what is that? But it creates moments that you cannot design, they just happen, and that's also nice, you know. That's actually the best moments in all architectural projects, is where suddenly you have to give up the control, or you thought you were in control of something, but you know, it just happens, and it's almost like an accident, and the accident becomes something really striking and beautiful, a special moment in the project. Happens here and then, and it's most of the time good surprises, but sometimes also bad surprises. Yeah, but yeah, this is like a human face, you know. We also like human faces that are not perfect. It's nice that each face has also slight imperfections, and these make faces and people attractive. And I think the same is true for buildings.
Thank you. So if you have further questions.
Yeah. Another question that we have is about the energy strategy for this project. So in our understanding of this project with the materiality, the uniblock actually serves to break down the facade surface and reducing the reflectivity and glare, especially during the daytime. And then also the facade plays an important role for the rain protection. And also you briefly explained for the MEP system of this project, but can you describe the energy scheme for this building, including passive and mechanical cooling and ventilation? And to what extent does the facade screen reduce the heat gain?
Also, I think the extent, why the facade is reducing the solar gain, I think I explained already now a couple of times. I don't think I need to explain this again. What in terms of overall mechanical system, I would think, that it's still a fairly traditional system. And, I think now 10 years later, one would probably try to work with a more innovative system. The systems are not, let's say, cutting edge what you could do. I would, if I could restart now, I would do a few things maybe a little bit differently, work more with photovoltaics, work more with wind. We looked into these things, but it's funny, also even with the photovoltaics, they don't work. They're not so effective in Hong Kong because they have often these overcast skies and so on. But anyway, and then also geothermal, for example, and so on. It's all things I would have liked to explore a little bit more. But the actual mechanical system is relatively straightforward. We still have done, and which is very different to many other projects in Hong Kong, displacement ventilation, for example. So it's a much more energy efficient system. I mean, it's low velocity air coming in from below, not forced air in from above. So that makes a huge difference. So it's much more with the natural flow of things. Cool air at low velocity comes in. So you already need less energy for the pressing the air in, but also the hot energy or the hot air all collects under the ceiling and is then extracted there. So typically in these galleries higher up where you don't have any art and for sure not any, no people, the temperatures can be a little bit higher. So that's also an important difference to forcing the air in from the top, because then the entire room is climate controlled and you force with jet nozzles the cold air in from the top. So more velocity, more energy for that, and you also need much more. You have to cool the air much more because there's no release for the hot air, so to say. You have to control and condition the entire space, a much bigger volume. So on that level, it's a very energy efficient building. Plus very little openings, and if openings, then they have this brise-soleil in front of it. Plus, I said that before, that even the closed portions of the facade have basically a sun protection on the outside, which is very unusual. I mean, typically that's not what you would do. A closed facade is a closed facade. It's a closed panel, basta. But it gets hot. You have the insulation directly behind it. I mean, it's a different story than having really a sun protection, so to say, in front of it, back ventilated with an air cavity behind it, where the excess heat can be removed. It's a very different system, and it's always better to do it like this. I mean, you always need these possibilities for the heat to go away. Does that answer a little bit your question?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you for the answer. For the last question, UT will ask for that.
So I'll ask maybe the final question. It is like, how has the Tai Kwun project influenced the design of your further projects? And like, would you agree that the application of digital fabrication in the field of architecture has aided the process of design and construction? What's your perspective?
You know, Tai Kwun was already informed by many other projects we have been working on beforehand. I mean, one field of expertise, so to say, from many years ago of ours is working with historic buildings in historic context. You know, to work with existing structures is something which is very satisfying for us, because they inspire the project quite a bit, you know, and it's more difficult to solve certain issues, and we like that because it triggers certain creativity and certain ideas, and it just makes it a very rewarding process. So since a long time, and a lot of our projects, I would say almost a quarter of our project is dealing with historic context and historic structures, and Tai Kwun is in the middle of it somehow. So it was already a lot informed by the experience we made with other projects like Kaisha or Tate Modern, or, you know, in parallel with that, Tai Kwun, I was also working on Park Avenue Armory in New York, for example, which is also very much a heritage, a very different scale again, you know, but some of the thinking processes and approaches and conceptual approaches are not so dissimilar, and it's a constant learning curve, and you always add to this learning curve somehow. And after Tai Kwun, of course, we again have more in our backpack, you know, and the next projects we can also profit from that. But at the end of the day, I have to say every project is different and is new, and it's good to have a rucksack full of stuff and tools and ideas and so on, but typically you have to always go a next step again, you know. It's very often you cannot just continue or rely on things you have found out in other projects. It's a constant development. I mean, it's never a standstill, so to say. And but maybe that's also us. I mean, we don't like that, you know. But as I said, I think it's important that we made this experience, and it makes maybe thinking about new projects a little bit easier. But nevertheless, you cannot stop thinking. You always have to continue thinking and questioning things and develop something very specific to that very specific task and context and client and program and so on. So yeah, it's a long journey, and we are not at the end of it yet. So yeah, and the other comment, I mean, I guess that's what you were asking, and that's also why I said in the very beginning, I'm not so sure this project is the best for this topic you are elaborating, which is a very interesting topic, but it's Tai Kwun is maybe not the one to showcase this idea, that notion of modularity, mass production, also, and so on. It's not that project. And there are other projects who do this in a much better way. Actually, the Parish Art Museum, you know, I don't know whether you have been there, but it's also close to New York. That is much more in this logic. I mean, there we really went, you know, out there and basically tried to develop a very complex and spatially interesting museum building with a lot of repetition, and with basically all materials off the shelf, and really like the cheapest and more direct things you can get. I mean, really vernacular almost. I mean, really local construction techniques and methods, and really tried to work with that repetition and that very simple ingredients to come up with something very special and unique. And I think that's in that regard, a much more successful example, for example.
Ascan, thank you so much. We really are so grateful for your time, your generosity to join us today. I especially enjoyed the tales of maybe the planning sagas and public consultation. I lived in Hong Kong through all those years, and certainly I was a supporter of each scheme whenever it was made public. But I think that's really great because those sorts of challenges are rarely shared to the public once the building is built. I also, appreciate and accept either the self-criticism that this isn't the best project to look at mass customization or modularity, which I think it really is. But it's also a really great example, which you haven't talked about, of a relationship between very, say, high-tech or advanced technology in terms of design and coordination, and then very lower technology or existing technology, say, of the casting processes of the facade, and a mix between that sort of higher and lower use of technology, which is very typical of a kind of condition of design and construction in China. And that's something we haven't really talked about. That really comes out in the...
Yeah, and I think that's a very interesting topic in general. I mean, we always call it this, and that's, I think we're fascinated by both. It's this digital analog thing, no? And combining those two methods and always going back and forth between them. And I think we are very much in that field of different forces. We are fascinated, and we have to rely on digital and computer technologies, and we want to explore them. We really want to challenge us also with that. But at the same time, we're also actually very drawn to the essential, to the analog, to the make it with your hands kind of approach. And I think we often in our projects try to play with both at the same time. And we think it's important that they complement each other, and they ultimately create the better result if you respect both of them and you're not focused only on one aspect of this.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We've taken so much of your time, and really very grateful.
Well, have a good luck with your next.
When our world returns to some normalcy and you make it to New York, please come visit us at New York Tech. We'd be
I definitely will do so.
All the best. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. Thank you all. Have a great day.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.